1800s or whatever. But no, they thought we were Russians come back. But yeah, so they weren't really aware of what was going on, a lot of the people over there. So I'd done all this time in a parachute regiment by then, and it turned out that despite this global war on terror, we were being sent back to Northern Ireland to cross Maglen. And it was at this time that I decided, right, I've had enough of the parachute regiment. I wanted to be involved in operations that were a higher tempo, and I wanted to be in operations where there was a chance for some more action, really. And so I volunteered to join the Special Air Service. I spent what turned out to be a 9-month tour across the Glen training to join that. Whilst we were over in Northern Ireland, the rest of the British Army deployed to Iraq, and I remember us all being really pissed off that we were stuck in this underground bunker with a surveillance tower stuck on it, watching the rest of the British Army, it seemed like, out in the desert, and we were stuck in Northern Ireland, which seemed like this conflict that was not even relevant anymore. So when we got back from the tour of Ireland, I joined the Special Air Service. It was a 6-month selection. There was about 120 of us on the course, and I think about between 10 and 15 of us, maybe 15 of us passed that. And a lot of the training that we'd done in the parachute regiment was kind of in some ways repeated but accentuated. We were still engaging that fight or flight mechanism, but we were in some ways as well adding in a bit of the conscious part of the brain to make decisions. Because it wasn't just the case of, like in the parachute regiment, you were taught that it was all about the enemy. So it was pretty straightforward. The response was to engage a perceived threat with violent force, lethal force. The initial invasion had happened, and Bush had declared victory, and there was a choice at the time. There were some of our guys were deploying to Afghanistan and some to Iraq, and a lot of us wanted to go to Afghanistan. We didn't really know, didn't really think that Iraq was the better of the two options in terms of seeing action. But I was told that I was going to deploy to Iraq. We went through a period of training and deployed out there. And I suppose straight away for me, the differences, I saw a lot of differences straight away compared to the previous operations I'd been on. And one of the main differences was the huge numbers. I was deployed into Baghdad. And one of the main differences was the huge numbers of private contractors that were working out there. That you definitely hadn't seen in Northern Ireland, hadn't seen in Yugoslavia, hadn't seen in Afghanistan, early on in Afghanistan. And they obviously had a lot of money. They were driving around in expensive gear, they had expensive weapons. So it was quite strange to see them. And they gave off the impression, and when you see them all hurrying around, that this was like a gold rush town, that there was money to be made here, and you could almost see the dollar signs sort of like trailing through their eyes. And another thing that was different was, even though I'd worked with American soldiers before, that this was the first time that I'd worked in pretty much an American unit. We were deployed into an American chain of command. We were part of an American unit, and there weren't any other British soldiers up there. There were a few British soldiers in a few positions, but we were in an American area. So that was all different. And we were told that our mission was to detain high value targets. And I suppose, how would you explain a high value target? It's someone who is an important person within the insurgency. So someone who is giving orders, someone who's financing it, someone who's helping to funnel weapons into the insurgency. And how do we do that job? Well, we use the system. Most states, most corporations, almost anything, they run systems. It goes all the way back to Adam Smith, Division of Labour, Henry Ford, production line. And we ran a similar system. And we broke the detention of high-value targets into compartments. And we had people working in each compartment. So in the first compartment, there were intelligence gatherers. And these people, on the whole, would pay for intelligence. So they'd make it be known, they'd let it be known, put the word out there, that they were looking for people working in the insurgency, and that they would pay money for that information. And people would come forward. And it's not surprising, really, because at the time in Iraq, there was huge levels of unemployment. Most people were struggling to survive, and even the small amounts of money that were on offer were probably quite attractive to people living in Baghdad and in Anbar province and places like that at the time. So there was a constant flow of this information coming in. Also, if you've been paid $200 for a piece of information, you've handed over the information, nothing bad's happened to you, nothing bad's happened to your family, a few weeks later, a few months later, you could do with some money again, what are you going to do? Go back. And so a lot of the time we're getting this information coming through, this intelligence, and that intelligence is then handed over to a new team, and that team carries out surveillance. Now they've been told that the person they're going to carry out surveillance on is a terrorist. They might go out, follow them in a car, you might have a helicopter or an aeroplane flying around up high above, watching them with cameras, and they're building up a picture of this person, where they live, where they work, who they hang around with. But the problem is that you've been told by someone you trust that this person is a terrorist. Everything they do becomes suspicious. So if you see someone digging in the back garden, you might assume or suspect that they're hiding weapons or hiding explosives. If you see them go in their car, put a big sort of package in the back of the car and drive to someone else, well, they could be ferrying weapons around. And anyone they go and meet becomes part of a bigger terrorist network. And so you build up this big picture of who these people are, where they live, who they hang around with, what their pattern of life is. And then once you've built up a big enough picture, you hand this information on to the next team, which is the team that I was in, the detention team. And again, if you're handed over this information by someone you trust, this person's a terrorist, these people in these buildings, they're all involved in insurgency, you need to go and detain them, then you're going to take that on face value. You've been told this person's a terrorist. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to describe what one of those jobs might have looked like. And I just want you to relax, maybe close your eyes and try and imagine that you're in this situation. So it's 2 o'clock in the morning, you're at home in bed, in your house. It's quiet, it's dark, it's nice and warm. Your kids are sleeping in the next room, and all of a sudden a huge explosion rips through your house. It's still dark, your ears are ringing, and there's dust everywhere. And you can hear men coming into your house. They're downstairs, they're coming up the stairs, they're in your room. You're being dragged out of your bed at gunpoint. You can hear your kids being dragged out of their bed. You get a fleeting view of them as you're dragged into another room downstairs. If you're a male, you're being held at gunpoint against the wall. If you're a female or a child, you've been taken into another room. You're being held gunpoint against the wall. You can hear the males in the house being interrogated now. They're being slapped around. They're being shouted at. And at the same time, you can hear men going all the way through your house. And what they're doing is they're turning out all of your drawers. They're turning out all of your cupboards. Everything is getting tipped out. And they've got these massive white bags. And what they're doing is they're filling up these bags with your stuff. Passports, bank statements, money, phones, computers, everything that you need to run your life, everything you need to identify yourself as yourself, everything you need to communicate with other people is being put into these bags. Your husband's still being shouted at, and after about 20 minutes, the men have put a hood on your husband, his hands are tied up, and your eldest son is in the same situation, and they're dragged out of the house along with these white bags with everything that you own that's of any importance. And within 20 minutes you're left in your house, it's quiet again, with a big hole where your front door used to be, with your whole house trashed, and your dad and your eldest son missing. And I like you to just think, and when I run a school workshop, I always ask the students to sort of shout out how that would make them feel, and you get a varied response. Angry, scared, frustrated, confused, all of those things. And I'm sure people go through a range of emotions when that happens to them. And that's what we did to people 2, 3, 4 nights a week. And you might be sat there thinking, well, it's terrorists you're going after. You've got to break a few eggs to make an omelette. But the problem is that often the person we were looking for, the person whose name we had, the person whose photograph we had, wasn't in the building. But that didn't stop us from detaining any male of military age. Anyone in there was deemed suspicious and was taken away by us. And it was carrying out these jobs that I started to have doubts about what I was doing. When you go into one house and the guy you're looking for isn't there, but you detain the people in the house anyway and take all their stuff, and then go through the next house and the next house and the next house, you start to wonder, are we causing more problems here than we're solving? You start to wonder, how would I feel if this was happening to me? You start to wonder, is this fueling the insurgency? And that's what I started to think. Also, I was affected by the looks on the kids. I've got kids myself. The looks on these kids when you were taking their dads, brothers out of the house started to affect me. But the missions kept coming. We kept on going on these missions, taking people back who we never knew before we met them, taking all their stuff back. Sometimes we'd be on jobs, we'd interrogate these people, and all of their story would add up. I fled Fallujah to get away from the fighting. I've come here, this farm, my uncle's given me this farm to get away. I just want to be left alone. I don't want any trouble. We'd get on the radio. We're not going to bring this person back. Bring the person back. It was the only time I ever saw an officer refuse a direct order. He refused to take the person back. We flew back to our camp. He was taken in, given a massive bollocking. The next night, our sister unit went and got the same person. And it's when things like that start happening that it's suddenly pushed right in front of you that actually it doesn't matter what decision you make, it doesn't matter what you think about things, this is going to carry on happening. And it carried on like this, carried on taking these people in. And stories that the guys were telling us within the unit who'd seen what happened in the next compartment started to trouble me as well. Because when we took these people back to our base, they had the hood on, they were cuffed, they were in a dish dash. Think about that image. What have we been told that that image represents? It's a terrorist, right? That's what a terrorist looks like. Someone with a hood on, hands cuffed, dish dash. So by the time we handed this person over to the next compartment, which is the interrogation compartment, who could blame these guys for thinking that these people were brutal terrorists? Some of our officers and some of my colleagues were telling me about how make sure that no one can see what's in the other compartments. Because if one person can see what's in all the compartments, they're less likely to carry out these actions. So this went on, and started to have severe doubts about what we were doing. Started to feel quite aggrieved that in some way we'd been prostituted out. At the time, this is how I felt at the time, that we'd been prostituted out to the Americans, that we were doing their work for them, and that somehow this wasn't anything to do with us. Why were we doing it? I mean, looking back at that now, that was actually wrong. All these people try and blame George Bush, try and blame the Americans for the war in Iraq. We were equally responsible for that war. We were eager participants. In fact, I think the Americans would have done it alone, but we were really keen to be involved in that. And I started to have severe doubts about all this, and I suppose that those doubts were confirmed when a CO came over to speak to us, and we're in a room, probably smaller than this. And he said something that sort of shook me at the time. And he said to us, "I'm worried that we're becoming the secret police of Baghdad." And I thought, did I just hear that? Did I just hear the CO of the Special Air Service say that he was worried that we were becoming the secret police of Baghdad? And that kind of burst a bubble or something, And I looked around the room we were in, and we were living in a villa on the banks of the Tigris where Saddam Hussein's henchmen used to live, next to a palace where one of his sons used to live. And we were using prisons that Saddam Hussein used to live. And I started to wonder, are we going after people that Saddam Hussein used to go after? We were using the same methods as Saddam Hussein. And it was a real shock to my system, having grown up, going back to those childhood stories, those commando book comics, Britain and the good guys. We stopped the Holocaust, we stopped the Japanese. And I felt disillusioned. I was sent home on a week's leave. When I got home on leave, I spent pretty much every day thinking about Iraq, thinking about my role in it. I was a professional soldier who had every intention of staying in for my whole career. But on the other hand, I had suddenly come to this realisation that what I was doing was actually against what I thought